So we're going to need that from last week. If you have your notes, that does help to kind of bring up or take a look at. But before we get there, the main thing is we're talking about inequalities again. So let's put a drawing up here. Let's go to our graph. And I'm going to wind up pulling this. So give me a second to draw it out. Instead of going by singles, I'm going to space out by 2, but each of these lines technically represents 1, so I'll label that in a second. So based off, here we have some polynomial function, which we went over properties last week about. So we're taking a step away from it. But what if I ask you to use this graph to answer these questions? We're just going to start with the first in the poll. Looking at this, which it is just a quick rough draft to try to get the idea of this. And using this graph to solve these inequalities. So what does it mean? I have f of x is greater than 0, f of x is less than 0, and I want to use this to solve these inequalities. So let's focus on A first. That way, if we have no clue, and this is the first time we're doing it, then we can use A to piggyback off getting B. So instead of writing out in function notation, we could think of it as y is greater than 0, but we want to refer to our function here with our graph instead. I like that. I prefer that. But instead of saying greater than 0, what's another way of thinking of this? Instead of saying greater than 0, what am I really talking about with my function? Because then I have less than or equal to 0. Melody, Sean, I see you're typing. There we go, that's positive. So instead for A, right, pretty much asking, right, where is it positive? Right, but when I'm saying where is it positive, what exactly am I talking about now? Right, so to answer this question, we're going to look for the intervals. We talked about increasing and decreasing intervals before when we went back to, what was it, quadratics with max and mins, and then with our polynomials with different intervals. So when I'm referring to where is it positive at, to get a little bit finer on this, we want to find the intervals of x. and x. Where a graph is above the x-axis, because that would be, right, positive in terms of our function. So I'm not going to write that whole piece out, but where will our intervals be? So where are the intervals? Remember, when we list our intervals, we're using our x values to represent where this function is positive. So can anyone list an interval? I'm going to wait on B to poll, but start to ask yourself, where are the x values? Where are the intervals of our graph that's above the x-axis? So it does help to color code, which I'm going to do, but what intervals do we have above our x-axis? Right, there we go, Sean. Thank you. So you have to highlight the pieces above the x-axis. I'm going to keep it color-coded. That part's above or in the positive, just like that piece there. When we put this in our interval notation, be very careful with this. Am I using parentheses? Am I using brackets? Well, notice the inequality here. Does not have an equal sign to it. So when we list out our intervals, I'll say, okay, what is the x value? Let me see if you can see where I'm pointing, right here, where we're starting to go above at 0. And as we follow it over, we say, okay, after this point, it's going to go below the x-axis. So this is our x value of 2. So Sean, right on, we have 0, 2. And we can either put a comma in between, or I'm be very picky since we've started using our union symbols. And the other interval, which we have there in blue, our x value is 3. And then as it keeps going, it's going to infinity, positive infinity. So this is one way of writing it. If we want to put it in our set builder notation, all right, the set of our x values such that, and then we can use it as an inequality, where we can put that x is greater than 0, but less than 2, or x is greater than 3. So questions with either notation, with getting the 0, the 2, the 3, the infinity. Any questions for this one? Right now we're just putting a visual with graphs. We are going to go to solving equations, actual equations with the inequalities. Right now we're just trying to get a visual here with these intervals. So obviously I've highlighted the parts that are above the x-axis, so we should look at B, and we have f of x, our function, right, is less than or equal to 0, meaning, right, below our x-axis in this case, or we want to look for the intervals of x of the graph below our x-axis. So this part I'm going to poll. If you want to put an interval notation, just because I think that would be easier to write, but if anyone wants to put it in set builder in the poll, feel free. But right, how would you write for part B when we have less than or equal to 0? So our parts left in orange, which we can see are below. So let me get the poll up. If you're stuck, if you're not sure, I know we've only just done one with A, kind of tell me where you're stuck. Are you not sure how to write out the intervals? So again, you can give it to me in interval notation or set builder notation. I think in your homework it leans more towards interval notation, but you do see both in this section. That's why I like to write both. But if you are stuck, try to let me know exactly where you're stuck, just so I can gauge that off just our first one. But let's try to go 2 minutes, 3 tops. And about 2/3 have responded, so I'll give about another minute. And if you're stuck, try to tell me what you're stuck with. Is it the interval notation? Is it still understanding what we're looking at with the graphs in terms of the values? All right, try to let me know just where you're stuck. So far, it looks like almost everyone is agreeing on the answers that I'm seeing in here. have 1, 2, 3 people, 2 people. About 15 seconds. I'm going to call it if you haven't answered. Okay, Keela, hopefully your audio is good now. Okay. All right, so obviously we can see all of our responses in there, but the majority of you were agreeing, and obviously we had some answers off. So let's take a look at what we have here in the orange, and you can see. So as I'm following from left to right, again, ask yourself, what are these X values? Right, as I'm following my graph here, well, where are we coming when the arrow is coming down in terms of our X values? We're coming from negative infinity. And then I reach this point here, which we know our X value is 0. Let me color code on part B. So we're going from negative infinity to 0. Now to finish that off, am I doing exactly what I did on A? Do I have parentheses, or do I have brackets, or do I have both on this, just to get a little technical? What do we think? Well, next to infinity, we should always have what? The negative, so sorry, the negative, Sean. But am I putting bracket or parentheses? Just want to make sure that we put the right notation. Because as you're working on the homework, I would hate to, have you being marked wrong and have to keep doing this over and over just because of small notation errors. Right. For me, I just really want you to make sure you understand the values that you should be getting for X, but we will get technical on this, yes. Because we can't cap an infinity, so we have that parenthesis. It's not a specific number that we can have as a max or min with precision. But the 0. So now the real question with the 0. Do I want parentheses again like we did in A, or do I want a bracket? And I give a Y. We're right. We're correct. Y. See, I see you're still typing. If you're not sure why, just like a guess, you can also say as well, but I see that you put because the point, and then I'm assuming you're finishing the sentence right now.
Yep.
The point only falls on 0. Someone help her out. So you might have the right thought process, but let's see if I can get a more distinct answer on this. So a couple other people, Elizabeth, were typing. All right, closed dot. But if we look at how I drew the blue before, I could say, okay, I had closed points there. But you're getting warmer. Go back and look at part B. Where's the difference with A and B? There we go, the equals to. Notice the inequality symbol. And we're going to have to be very cautious of our inequality symbol, especially when it comes to solving. And we have to look at these tables we're going to create with intervals coming up, kind of like what we did last class with intervals where we tested points. We're going to have that again today. But notice it's an equals. So we have that inclusion where we want the bracket. Because this means we're actually including the point 0 here. Before, right, when we had greater than 0, well, technically not 0, but meaning positive or negative, but anything below we're actually including. So if it falls on the x-axis, in that case specifically, we're including it for part B. if it fell on the x-axis directly for part A or not. We can't include it in both. If you get one vote, vote. You're either voting in A or voting in B if you fall on that line right in the middle. It can't count for two places when we look at these closed points, all right, or our x values that are included in the function. So 0, we're having the inclusion with, right, our part B. If I had switched and put the equal sign in A with the inequality not in B, well, then we would have brackets in part A instead of the parentheses. So pay very close attention to small details like that. Again, my main concern is that you're able to understand why are we going from -infinity to 0 in the first place. But then as you're putting your answer in, to make sure we know, all right, why is it telling us a bracket versus a parentheses? Small things in that part that can be frustrating with entering. All right, but now our other interval. So we're going through, make sure you can see my pointer still. So we're above. When we come below, we can see here's our other piece below. Okay, so in the poll, it looks like, again, the majority have had it, but what are our x values going from here to here? Well, we're at +2 for the x, and then it goes back up here to +3 in terms of being below. So we have right, 2 to 3. And then again, set builder notation for this one, just to write both x such that, right, for inequality for the first interval, you would have x less than or equal to 0. Right, or our compound one, not 1. X is less than or equal to 3, and x is greater than or equal to 2 to represent those intervals. Any questions on this first one? Because I'm going to put you in a breakout room for a second one where we're taking it up a notch. Sean. Yep, saying that's frustrating to have to get it wrong because of the bracket. So we'll get some practice in. And the numbers are the first component of this, but then just knowing the correct notation. Any questions? Any questions before we go to a new page? All right, so same directions. I'm not going to write the directions on here. I'll put part A and B, but you're going to use the graph to solve, and you're going to be finding these intervals, right, for part A and part B. And in your groups, if you want to write it out both ways to get practice with interval and set builder, you can, but I'm really going to be focused on your interval notation as I go through and look at your groups. But let me start drawing the graph. If anyone does have a question, we can always go back to that. And copy the graph down if you want to start drawing on your own. So I do recommend, have a highlighter. You can trace it, color code, kind of what I do. But I will copy the graph over into your breakout room so no one has to redraw it. Let me try to leave some room so that to the right. Should be about halfway, should be good. And it's mainly going to be discussing and talking. There's not a lot of work you have to show with these as you're working on them in your groups. Spacing this out. So each of those represents 1, so going up to 3 there. Obviously, last week we got into our asymptotes. Alright, that's as good as it's going to get by hand on this. So let me copy this out, that way it'll go into your breakout room. I'm going to set your timer just for 10 minutes, hopefully. If you need the time to discuss it, that's fine. If everyone finishes before the 10 minutes, then of course we'll end early. But I will be popping back and forth into it, like usual. Just make sure whoever is the presenter to turn on in case we want to write on there, but put the intervals. Oh, and I forgot to put the problems. That would help first. Let's not save that graph. This way this copies over too. So I'll leave some space. You can put your answer right underneath A, whatever you decide as a group for your final answer.